Well, hello. I hope you're enjoying this beautiful May weekend. And this weekend, we bring this series, six-part series, to a close. It's a series that started on Easter weekend called Reason to Believe. Next weekend, our Director of Youth Ministries, Aaron Buer, is going to be teaching. And the weekend following that, which is the first weekend of June, I'll start a brand new series the first weekend of June. And so those of you who are in the building for the very first time or visiting one of our campuses for the first time, just so glad you're here. I know that some of you have been with us every single weekend of this study, Reason to Believe. And today, as we wrap this series up, I just ask that our gracious God would meet us in this space, that he would soften our hearts, that he would open our eyes and give us the ability to respond to what we hear. So let me take you back about 6 years. I think it was 2011. And there's two guys that are in an art gallery in New York City. One of the guys' his name is Steve Garver, and he's speaking in New York City. Friend of his found out that he was going to be there, an artist, Mako Fujimura, and so he said, hey, I've got some art I'd love for you to come and see. And so while Steve Garver is in New York City, he goes to the art gallery where Fujimura's art was on display. And one of the paintings there was this right here, and I know some of you just don't appreciate art that looks like that. You know, you say, Jeff, I could do that. Probably not, but this is a work of art that was part of the 400th anniversary of the King James translation of the Bible. King James Bible, translated in 1611, the 400th anniversary, 2011, they had works of art commissioned, and this was one of the works of art for the Gospels. And as these two guys are looking over this, Steve Garber and the artist, Steve Garber knew the story that this work of art represented. And he said to Fujimura, if that story were not in the Bible, I do not think I would be a Christian. If that story were removed from the scriptures, he said, I'm not sure that I would be a believer. The painting is called The Tears of Christ. And in the story, it's a story of loss. It's a story of pain. It's a story of grief. And in the story, we not only find Jesus at a funeral, we find Jesus at a funeral for a dear friend. So the story opens this way. If you have a copy of the Bible, I would love for you to follow along in John chapter 11. And this is where the story begins. It says, now a man named, and it gives us a guy's name. What's the dude's name? A man named Lazarus was sick. Now, by sick, I don't think it means sore throat. By sick, I don't think it means mild cold. His two sisters, Mary and Martha, are deeply concerned that their brother is so ill that he might not make it. And as the story progresses, you're going to find out that he doesn't. And so when it says Lazarus is sick, think in and out of consciousness, think can't hold anything down, think convulsive fever, and they're scared. And they send word to Jesus. Now, John, the author of this story, gives us just some rich background details. It just gives the place where he lives. It says he was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And these are three siblings, Martha, Lazarus, and Mary. Now it says, now this Mary, because there's a bunch of Marys, Mary the mother of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. So John even goes into details, okay, let me tell you which Mary this is. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So there's a story where this Mary, one of the sisters here, dumps this perfume on Jesus' feet, wipes his feet with her hair. He goes, okay, it's that Mary, which lets you know something. There is an intimate connection here between Jesus and this family. There is a close relationship. And so John says, oh, just Remember here, these people are really close. And then in verse 3, it says, so the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord. It doesn't say Lazarus is sick. It says, Lord, the what? The one you love is sick. And Jesus is supposed to know who that is. And I don't think Jesus is anywhere in the area. Now, did you see the town? It said Lazarus lived, and the name of the village was there. Did any of you detect that? It's like back in verse 1. What did it say? In what? In Bethany, okay. Bethany is just 2 miles away, less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. And we could show you Jerusalem and Bethany, but the dots would basically be on top of each other, all right? So when Jesus is in Jerusalem, where the temple is, and often there was conflict that swirled around him, I think that the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus was a house that he could go to get away from the chaos, away from the noise, that their home became his home when he was in the area of Jerusalem. And things get so hot in Jerusalem in relationship to Jesus in John chapter 10 that he leaves that part of the country, and it says he crosses the Jordan River. And so I think Jesus is a day's hike away. Now Lazarus gets sick, and the sisters, Mary and Martha, they send a messenger and they go, you've got to find our friend. I mean, Jesus had healed so many other people. Wouldn't he show up? Wouldn't he show up for his friends? Go find him and let him know, Jesus, the one that you love, is sick. I think that Lazarus dies while the messenger is still on the way. When Jesus makes it to the house of Martha and Mary, Lazarus has already been dead 4 days. Where we see Jesus today, and where we see this story today, it's a story of pain, it's a story of loss, it's a story of grief, and it's a story of confusion. And in this series called Reason to Believe, I'm conscious of the fact that there are people exploring the faith. At the same time, there are people questioning their faith. I used to believe, Jeff, I just don't know anymore. And there are also people whose faith has grown old and cold, and it just needs to be resuscitated. It just needs to be revived. And in this series, we've talked a little bit about intellectual reasons to believe. That is, there are some individuals that have, listen, Jeff, I'm exploring the faith, but I've just some intellectual questions that I just need to have answered. Is the Bible reliable? I mean, here, John's account of Jesus' life. How do I even know this was actually written by John, in the first century, one of the eyewitnesses? Can it be, the fact that it says that Jesus came back to life, a resurrection, can that be verified in any way? Just give me intellectually, listen, I just need a reason to believe. I'm moving toward faith, but as I take this leap, just let me know it's a leap that's grounded in reason. Let me know there's a reason to believe. But there would be intellectual questions. Okay, what we need to talk about today is something radically different. Not questions of the mind, but questions of the heart. There are some people that don't come to faith because of questions of the heart. There are some people who abandon the faith because of questions of the heart. And there are people whose faith becomes old and cold because of a troubled heart. And by a troubled heart, I'm talking about the dad that bailed on you when you were 2 years old. I'm talking about the wife that dumped you, or the husband that took off. By a troubled heart, I'm talking about the child that has run so far and cost you so many sleepless nights, and you have prayed and prayed and prayed, and you wonder, is God even there? And if he's there, does he care? You understand what I'm saying here? These are not just intellectual problems of the mind, these are heart questions. I'm talking here about the funeral that left such a gaping hole in your life that you really wonder if you will ever recover. I'm talking about seasons of depression that you fall into and you can't always find a way to pull out of. And I'm talking here about aloneness. Some of you just feel so very much alone in life. These are problems of the heart, and a question that comes up as a heart question, not just intellectual, can the Bible be trusted, etc., but as a heart problem is God there and can he be trusted? Is God there and can he be trusted? And so whether you're exploring the faith, whether your faith has been shaken, whether your faith has grown old and cold and needs to be revived, or whether you're tracking and fully tracking, I just hope that this conversation today about Jesus at a funeral and about the tears of Christ just kind of gives you a different window on this whole conversation about reason to believe. So Martha and Mary, the sisters, they send a messenger to track Jesus down. Probably takes a guy a day to get there. And he finds Jesus and the disciples and he says, Jesus, your friend, man, he is sick, and I mean sick, and it does not look good. So right about now, it's time for Jesus to look at his disciples and say, everybody up, we got to get moving. There's a potential crisis and tragedy here. We got to get out of here. I want you to check out verse, first thing Jesus says to his disciples is this. He says, this illness will not end in death, but that God would be glorified and that the Son of God would be glorified. He's basically saying, listen, my friends, there's going to be death along the way, but Jesus says the end of the story is not going to end in death. But then John adds this detail about the relationship where he says in verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, which is an interesting way to word that. And when Jesus had visited their home, John, Jesus' disciple, had observed them. And John goes, now listen, I want you to understand something. Jesus had deep affection for Martha. Jesus had deep affection for Mary. And Jesus had deep affection for Lazarus. And they're named individually. It's not, now Jesus loved the family. It's like Jesus loved Martha, Jesus loved Martha's sister, Jesus loved Lazarus. And I think that's important. And Jesus loved Jeff, and Jesus loved Chris, and Jesus loved Alex, Andrew, and Sarah. Somehow the fact that they're named individually, John wants us to know that there's deep affection here. And then verse 6 lands surprisingly. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Isn't that exciting? Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus so, not but, so, because he loved them, he stuck around on the other side of the Jordan River for 2 more days. Does that mess with you? I think it messed with them. Jesus is going to be powerfully at work in this story. But Jesus' top priority does not seem to be immediately to swoop in and to rescue them from the emotional chaos that they're in. Jesus is at work in the story not simply in spite of Lazarus' illness and not simply in spite of Lazarus' death. God is going to be at work in and through and around this illness and this death. But just before we move on in the story, I think it's important just to camp out there for a second. It is possible for God to love you very, very deeply and for you to enter some very painful and confusing space. Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and so he stayed where he was 2 more days without swooping in. Can I say that just one more time? It is possible for God to have deep love and affection for you and still for you to enter some painful, chaotic grief. Finally, Jesus looks at his disciples and says, let's go to Lazarus. He says, Lazarus is dead. And Jesus said to his disciples, he says, and I'm glad that I wasn't there, because there's something that I want you to see so that your faith would grow and so that you would believe. So Jesus travels with his disciples back across the Jordan River, probably a day's hike. So it takes a day for a messenger to get there. Jesus sits on this for a couple days. And then there's the day that he travels to Bethany. And in first century Israel, they did same day burial. I mean, I don't want to get too graphic here. Embalming had been invented, but it was like for pharaohs down in Egypt. You didn't do it as country people in Israel. So the day that the person died, boom, they go into a tomb, into a grave, often a cave in a hillside, and you put spices around their body and such. But Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. And something interesting that happens is Jesus doesn't enter the village and go right to their house. He stays outside. I think he wants to have some one-on-one conversation with the sisters without all of the mourners and family and a swirl of friends all there. And so he waits outside and he sends word in, and Martha discovers that Jesus is there. So Mary stays in the house and Martha heads out. And I just want you to see what Martha says when she interacts with Jesus. It says, Lord, Martha said to Jesus. Can you read out loud with me what comes next? If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Martha says to Jesus, you healed so many. If you had been here, our brother would not have died. I wonder if this is something that they've been saying to each other for days. If only he were here, if only he were here, if only he were here. So she says, Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And she goes on and says, but even, I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. I still believe that God is with you, but I wish you had been here for us. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise in the resurrection at the last day. I know that there will be sometime out there in the future when I'll see him again. There's a resurrection at the end of time. I want you to notice this very, very carefully. Some of the most powerful, I don't know how many funerals I've conducted over the years when I've drawn people's attention to this story when a loved one who knew Jesus had passed away. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And then he asked her a question. What's the question? Do you believe this? Okay, let me ask you to play along. I want you to hear yourself say this. Ready? Jesus said, here we go, ready? I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? And Martha would respond by saying, yes, I do believe you're the Messiah that has come into the world. Jesus stops in this moment. Martha is heartsick, debilitating grief, suffocating grief, mourning, tearful loss. And Jesus says, I am two things. I am I am the resurrection and the life. In John's gospel, John's telling of the life of Jesus, this issue about Jesus saying, I am the life, I am the life, I am the life, I am the life. It comes up again and again and again and again. Beginning of John's gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then you find these words in chapter 1, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Be stunned and be shocked. What John does at the beginning of his gospel is says, listen, just want you to know, between God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, it was God the Son, Jesus, at the beginning of time, way before the manger in Bethlehem. Through him all things were made. That Jesus contained the creative force beyond our world. This next slide, just an image John says, listen, through him all things were made. What was made through Jesus? All things. Through him all things were made. Nothing without him was made that was made. In him was, what was the word? In him was life. John is saying, no. This resurrection, I am the resurrection and the life. Right out of the gate in John's gospel, we're told of this. Skip ahead to John chapter 8. Jesus says, I'm the what? I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. John chapter 10, 2 chapters later, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and that they may have it to the full. This is the chapter before the Lazarus death chapter. This is chapter 10, the Lazarus story is in chapter 11. Jump ahead to chapter 16. It's after the Last Supper, and Jesus would say this, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So this is this thread that is woven through John's gospel, his telling of the life of Jesus, where he says, listen, in him was life. He is the bread of life. The thief comes to kill and destroy. He came that we might have life and have it to the full. He is the resurrection and the life. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He's just life, 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 life. Jesus is saying here, I have life as my essence. He doesn't say, I have resurrection and I have life. He says, I am resurrection and I am life and I am a life-giving force. The importance of getting connected to Jesus through faith is that it is a life-giving connection that begins now and that the stopping of your heart does not interrupt. It is life that Jesus gives now, a quality of life. He enters your heart and gives you life. And on that day, when either through old age, a heart attack, you stroke out and die, or an automobile accident, that life, boom, it just pushes into the next world. It is life that does not stop with the end of your life in the here and now. This is what Jesus is saying when he says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. He's saying your physical death, the stopping of your physical heart, does not prevent this life from continuing. He's talking here about life after death. He does say, whoever believes in me. Get connected to me now as the source of life, because this connection to me will begin now and push right through that point where your heart stops beating and where your brain waves cease. My dear friends, I believe that as a general rule, our view of the next life is pathetic. Almost every cartoon you look at that shows this image of heaven, number one, it's monochrome. It's just white, floaty clouds, maybe harps, maybe some angels fluttering around, maybe St. Peter at the gate. I look at those cartoons and I go, okay, I'm bored like after 16 minutes. They're just simply not that compelling. Question, why would the next creation be less interesting than the creation we know right now that has waterfalls, that has streams, that has opportunities to mountain bike and to hike and to watch hummingbirds fly by your window? Why in the world would the next world, the unfallen world, the recreated world, be less interesting than the one we stare at now? What I believe is that the next world will have all of the beauty that we engage with now, yet without pain and without pollution and without family fracturing, without frustration in work, without breakups and without breakdowns. I believe what God has planned for you is all the beauty without the pain and all the adventure without the anxiety. Don't have time to say too much about this, but when Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life, he who believes in me and dies will live. Do you believe this? The life that is to come, I believe it is interesting and compelling. There's just a couple different resources I'd love to point you toward. And one of them is just a tiny little booklet. The author's name is Randy Alcorn. He wrote this big, I think 300-word, hardback edition of a book called Heaven, but then they condensed many of the chapters down to just this one little pamphlet. One of the chapters is called What Won't Be in Heaven. It's just like a couple pages long in this booklet. I just picked this little section to read here. No arthritis, no handicaps, no cancer, no taxes, no bills, no computer crashes. No weeds, no bombs, no drunkenness, no traffic jams and accidents, no septic tank backups, no mental illness, no unwanted emails. I like that one. Close friendships, but no cliques, laughter, but no put downs, intimacy, but no temptation to immorality. No hidden agendas, no backroom deals, no betrayals. Imagine meal times full of stories, laughter, and joy, without fear of insensitivity, inappropriate behavior, anger, gossip, lust, jealousy, hurt feelings, or anything that eclipses joy, And then he goes, that will be heaven. We've picked a bunch of these up. And at the end of the service today, you'll be informed about how to pick up a copy of this. But for those of you who, from time to time, think about the next world, just Randy Alcorn, beautiful little job in this thing, this little booklet. Also, love for you to find on our website. It just says Easter 2016. So this would be a year and a couple months ago. I had the opportunity on that Easter weekend just to talk about our faulty view of the next life and how boring and pathetic it is. And it was, some of you remember this as the bucket list sermon. And I would, again, if you're just wondering about this and what's out there, I'd love for you to pick up Alcorn's book, but I'd also love you to go back to the Easter service. You can find this on our website. Some of you are curious and some of you are far more than curious. I know at any given time at Ada Bible Church, there are individuals, the cancer's back. You're doing everything you can to get treated and to seek wise counsel and treatments, but you really don't know whether this will take you out. There's others that just the aging process is catching up with you. Some of you go, Jeff, my parents died. My dad died in his 60s, my mom in her early 70s. And you go, I'm 78. I've beaten all the family odds so far. And you know you're probably not going to live to 169. And you're thinking about going home. This is John chapter 11. At the Last Supper, Jesus would say this to his disciples. He says, listen, my Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? And then he follows it by saying, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. Here's the deal. It's not simply about getting to heaven, it's about being with Jesus. Jesus says, I want you to be where I am. I want so much to be with you, and I want so much for you to be with me. It's like he is the life-giving force, and when we connect with him, it gives us life in this life, but part of the life-giving force that continues into the next world has to do with, I believe, a resurrected body in a resurrected planet with our resurrected Lord. Jesus says, I want you to be with me. And so a word to some of you who are, I wouldn't say fearing death, but knowing that it could be coming. And it is for all of us. Some of us are just more aware of it than others. Yes, this is about going home. It's about going home. It's about going home. It's about trusting in Jesus now and establishing this connection with the life force that continues into the next world. I don't know if you noticed that one little verse where Jesus said, your brother will rise again. And Martha responded by saying, I know, in the resurrection at the last day. Even when we are aware that loved ones have gone home to be with the Lord, my friends, there can still be incredible grief at their loss and a deep missing because they're no longer with us. Burying a friend who was a believer, tears often still accompany that burial and the grief of missing someone who was key to your life. It's a thin little book on grief, very personal. It's written by a guy by the name of Nicholas Walterstorff. He used to be a professor at Calvin College and then moved to an Ivy League school. He lost his son, Eric, in a climbing accident. Eric was in Europe in his early 20s, was killed in a climbing accident. And this little thin volume is called Lament for a Son, and it's not a how-to, it's not a solve the problem of pain, it's not why do bad things happen to good people, it's just, he just chronicles his grief in this book, Lament for a Son. When Martha says, I know, there'll be a resurrection at the end of time, I know. Listen to Walterstorff's words here. It says, yet Eric is gone. Here and now he is gone. Now I cannot talk with him. Now I cannot see him. Now I cannot hug him. Now I cannot hear his plans for the future. He says, that is my sorrow that he's gone now. In the next slide, he says, a friend said, remember, he's in good hands. I was deeply moved, but that reality does not put him back in my hands now. Grief is real, and tears are real, and missing is real, and pain is real, and the death of Lazarus is awful. And the fact that Jesus says, I am resurrection and life. He who believes in me and dies will live again. Do you believe this? But still there's the missing now. Martha goes back to the house. And she whispers to her sister Mary, she says, the teacher's here. And Mary jumps up and runs out to be with Jesus. And there are a bunch of mourners there that have come from the city of Jerusalem, just a couple miles away. And they think, oh, she's gone to the tomb in order to wail, in order to mourn. And so they jump up and they follow her. But Mary is heading out to see Jesus. Mary says something. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Does that sound familiar to you? That's the same thing Martha said, same thing her sister said. I wonder if they have been saying that for 4 days. If only he had been here, if only he had been here, if only he had been here. So Mary comes out, says she fell at his feet. I just think she crumples. She says, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. And so now Jesus has got to go through it all over again. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, do you believe this? And that's not what Jesus does. Totally. Mary and Martha have an identical opening line, and yet Jesus has a radically different response to the sisters. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews from Jerusalem who had come along with her also weeping, he was what? 2 words. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Deeply moved, deeply troubled by this whole situation, by this grief, by this loss, by this pain. And he says, where is he? And they said, follow us, he's over here. Verse 35 happens to be the shortest verse in the Bible, 2 words. What is it? Jesus wept. Jesus cries. In Tim Keller's book, Encountering Jesus, he notes how the sisters have the same line, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. And yet Martha gets information. I am the resurrection, I am the life. He who believes in me and dies will live again. He who believes in me and lives will never die. Do you believe this? Mary, she just gets tears. And what Tim Keller points to there that is so powerful is that sometimes when we're with friends in terrible grieving agony, sometimes they need the ministry of truth and sometimes they need the ministry of tears. There are times when someone is in a deep season of loss and confusion and they need an eyeball-to-eyeball conversation where we say, listen, you need to have courage. God will be good to you. I believe that God will be faithful to you. I don't know what's up here, but I believe that God will be present and be working through this and be working around this, and he's powerfully at work in your life, even through this mess. Sometimes people need the ministry of truth. Sometimes they need people to show up and say nothing and just be with them. Sometimes they need the ministry of truth. Sometimes they need the ministry of tears. What I love Tim Keller saying here is he says, listen, we're gonna mess this one up a lot. People need a word from us and we just stand there and don't say anything, cry with them. Or people need someone just to cry with them and we talk. He says, we're gonna mess this one up a lot. He says, listen, Jesus never did. Jesus knew when to say, Jesus knew when to weep. But he is deeply disrupted and deeply troubled by the grief the sisters are experiencing, by the planet that he created that because of sin and death messes with families and it messes with hearts. It says Jesus is deeply distressed, deeply troubled in his spirit, and then Jesus cries. Which brings us back to the painting in New York City called The Tears of Christ. And so the artist is showing Steve Garber this painting that he did, and it's on Jesus wept, Jesus troubled in spirit, Jesus tears mingling with Mary and Martha's tears. And this is where Garber says, if that story were not in the Bible, I do not know if I would be a Christian. Because it's not simply God from the outside at a distance, it's God, it's the tears of God. It's God deeply troubled by many of the things that trouble us. So in an essay that Garber wrote about this is what he said. He says that God has tears crying out over the death of his friend, outraged, because that is what the word that is used twice in the passage, groaning deeply in his spirit, has meant. Groaning deeply in his spirit has meant almost everything to me, the fact that God has tears. The fact that Jesus shows up at a funeral and that he weeps over the condition, over the pain, over the loss. He says that means almost everything to me. And then this next part of the quote, it says, his tears at Lazarus' death are formative for us, teaching us that some things are worth crying over because they are so wrong, because they are so grievous, because they are so awful, because they are so unjust, so much not the way it's supposed to be. Here is Jesus, God in human skin, entering his own planet, and he shows up at his friend's house, and they're just in debilitating sadness. And Jesus breaks down and cries with them. Now, the point here is this, because often people have difficulty coming to faith, or they question their faith, and it's not an intellectual issue, it's over matters of the heart. I would just pause at this moment and say, what if God was deeply troubled too by the dad that bailed on your family, by the mom that was emotionally disconnected, by the child that has broken your heart, by the pain you carry in your body or the emotional scars that you bear? What if there are tears of God over your aloneness and over your vast disappointment in life? See, this story is about the tears of Christ, about the fact that he is deeply, deeply connected and troubled by many of the things that deeply, deeply trouble us. Jesus is intimately connected to their pain. And he weeps. Verse 36, then the Jews says, man, see how he loved him. He really loved this guy. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? The blind man that got healed that we looked at last weekend, that was in Jerusalem, just a couple miles from this village. And they're going like, why didn't he show up for his friends? They walked to the tomb where Lazarus is, and Jesus said, roll the stone back in front of the cave. And Martha says, Jesus, you do not want to go in there. We buried him 4 days ago, and the aroma of the decomposition has got to be awful. You do not want to go in there. Jesus has the stone rolled away, and it says when he had said, and then Jesus prays, and he says, Father, I'm not saying this out loud. I'm saying this out loud. I know that you always hear me, but I just want them to know that you're listening to me. And he offers this out loud prayer about honoring his Father. And then it says, when he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice. He yells, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to him, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And I want more than that. Like, did all of the crock pots that people brought in for the funeral become the welcome home party open house? You know, and it's like that. Take his grave clothes off, and you go, you're kidding me. That's it. That's almost it. Let's talk about belief. Verse 45, then many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary, seen what Jesus did, believed in him. It results in a bunch of people, I believe he is the Messiah. I believe he was sent from God. But check this out. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Back to Jerusalem. You can't believe this. Now he calls a dead guy out of the grave that we buried 4 days ago. And if you read on from this in chapter 12, you would find out that this raising of Lazarus accelerates the hatred of Jesus and movement toward his execution. Read a statement last week where someone said Jesus canceling Lazarus' funeral meant that he would have to make plans for his own. This is chapter 11. The Last Supper is chapter 13. Jesus is on his way here. And I think it's so important to remember that this life that Jesus came to offer, I am the bread of life. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I've come that you might have life and have it to the full. In him was life, that my life cost his death. Jesus would say this in John chapter 10. It would say, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. In John chapter 10, Jesus knows that this day is coming. So, what are these stories supposed to do? Jesus shows up at a wedding and the bride and groom have run out of wine, and Jesus takes water and turns it into wine. What's that doing in John chapter 2? Jesus is tired and sits down by a well, and a woman shows up who's burned through 5 marriages, and she's from a different ethnic group. She's a Samaritan, he's a Jew, and Jesus sits down with her and has an honest conversation about life water and the thirst we have in life and how to quench that thirst. Jesus is in Jerusalem, and there's a guy begging who's been blind from birth, and Jesus restores his sight. Jesus is in Bethany and restores Lazarus to his sisters. Story after story after story. John, why? Why did you write these? Why did you record them? And at the end of his novel, at the end of his book, he writes these words, but these things are written that you may what? Believe that Jesus is Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. John said, look, there's a lot of other miracles Jesus did that I didn't write down, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is Messiah, and that believing you might have life through his name. John says, I just used this ink and this parchment and wrote story after story after story after story so that you would go, I trust you. John says, I wrote this story so that you would have a reason to believe. I'd like to conclude the series with a story that I used at the beginning of the series on Easter weekend. Those of you who were with us on Easter weekend, we talked about this guy right here. His name is Lee Strobel. After getting his journalism degree, he graduated from Yale Law School and became an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune, an award-winning investigating reporter and chief legal counsel for the Chicago Tribune. You want to know his views on religion. This is what he wrote about the Bible. This would have been in the 70s. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, were merely religious propaganda, hopelessly tainted by overactive imaginations and evangelistic zeal. He said, I just believe the entire accounts of Jesus were fabricated. And then Lee Strobel's wife became a believer, became a Christian. He wanted to divorce her because he could not imagine living with a Christian. And Strobel was an atheist with absolutely no belief in the Bible. And so what he did, he says, listen, before I write this whole thing off, what I would like to do is to at least apply the same principles of investigative journalism to the Bible that I apply to my own trade and my own craft. And he embarked on a 1-year, 9-month study to ask some basic questions. Can the Bible be trusted? Could the resurrection have actually happened? And he set about to interview expert after expert after expert after expert in archaeology, history, psychology. And he ended up at the end of that 1 year, 9 months, giving his life to Jesus and becoming a believer. Lee wrote this book, The Case for Christ, where if you get your hands on that book, he walks you step by step through his own spiritual journey. Now, on Easter weekend, we looked at this confession, this prayer that Lee gave, and it says, so on November 8, 1981, I talked with God in a heartfelt and unedited prayer, admitting and turning from my wrongdoing, receiving the gift of forgiveness and eternal life through Jesus. I told him that with his help, I wanted to follow him and his ways from here on out. And so I wanted to wrap this series really where it started, just by looking at Lee's prayer, because it involves, I think, so many of the good components and I think a sample prayer of a way one would come to God. He says, admitting and turning from my wrongdoing. I mean, that's powerful. You know, God, I didn't earn you. It's like I have blown it in more ways than I could possibly know. Receiving the gift of forgiveness, that's a powerful statement too. Not somehow becoming religious enough in order to measure up, but that forgiveness is a gift to be received based upon the fact that Jesus stood in for you and took your place. Receiving forgiveness and receiving life from the life giver. And this last part is very powerful. I told him with God's help, I told God that with his help, I wanted to follow him in his ways from here on out. It's not just I want forgiveness, it's like I want to yield my life to your direction. Listen, some of you have been walking through this series week after week after week, and you sense that God has been nudging you and calling you. I would just say maybe today is the day. Just to go, Jeff, that's exactly where I am. And here and now, today, I admit that I am flawed in more ways, that I need God's gift of forgiveness based on Jesus' sacrifice, and I desire to follow him with my life. I know that some of you did that years ago and just kind of drifted. You made a confession of faith, or there was a church service or a camp where you asked Christ into your life and you just drifted. I would suggest that sometimes it's good to go back and just to say, I want to reaffirm. I just want to reaffirm. I know that I've drifted from God. I know that he gave his life for me. And now I want to embark on this next journey of following him with my life. My hope is that 2, 3, 5, and 12 years from now, we'll be running into people in and around Ada Bible Church and in other parts of the country. And when we ask them, tell me a little bit about your faith journey, they would say, I remember when I gave my heart to Christ. It was this series called Reason to Believe, when I had been holding out for way too long, trying to define life on my own terms and trying to hold the giver of life at a distance. That's when I recognized who I was and who he was. That's when I recognized the tears of Christ that could truly empathize with the pain I had been through. That was when a couple of my intellectual questions were answered. And that was when I was given a reason to believe. For those of you exploring the faith, for those of you questioning faith, for those of you whose faith has grown old and cold and it's no longer a faith worth having, know that there is a reason to believe. There is a step of faith, but the step of faith is based on the fact that Jesus came and gave himself for you, and that he is a God who is present, and that he is a God who can be trusted. I'm going to offer prayers for us as we close the service, and then someone will come up in each of our rooms. Campus pastors or room hosts, and dismiss each room individually. May I ask you to stand here and at our other locations as well. Gracious God, we have been asking through this series, give us eyes to see and hearts to respond. Gracious God, even today, soften hard hearts, open blind eyes, that we may see you and trust you. In Jesus' name, amen.